Confined space entries are never routine. You may use the same equipment, run the same tests, and even work with the same crew. But the conditions you face inside are different every time. Low oxygen levels, gas leaks, and toxic fumes are hazards that can knock you out in a heartbeat. Because of the dangers presented by confined spaces, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration created the permit-required confined space regulation. Confined spaces are spaces that are large enough for a person to enter, but access to the space is physically limited or restricted. They are large enough to work in, but are not designed for continuous use. Confined spaces can include tanks, vessels, storage bins, hoppers, vaults, and pits. There can be a number of different types of hazards associated with confined spaces. Conditions to watch out for when working with these spaces include hazardous atmospheres, such as those containing flammable or toxic gases and vapors, atmospheres with too little or too much oxygen, or tight areas that could trap or suffocate workers. You also need to look out for spaces that contain materials which can engulf people working in them. Of course, the best way to avoid these hazards is to bring your work outside the confined space. Unfortunately, this isn't always possible. In these cases, facilities must set up and use written permit space entry programs to regulate entry into the confined spaces. As part of this program, whenever there is a potential for danger, a written entry permit must be issued for the space before work inside can begin. Warning signs will also be posted at the entrances to all regulated confined spaces. These will tell you that a written permit is required for entry, or that the space is completely off limits. You will also receive training as part of the program. Depending on the responsibilities you have, you will be trained as an entry supervisor, an entrant, or an attendant. The entry supervisor is the person responsible for determining if acceptable entry conditions are present at a permit space where entry is planned. Authorizing, overseeing, and terminating entry operations are the responsibility of the entry supervisor as well. One of the most important responsibilities of an entry supervisor is to oversee atmospheric testing. There are 3 basic tests, and they must be done in a specific order: oxygen content, the presence of flammable gases, vapors, or dusts, and the existence of toxic contaminants. The first test is to see how much oxygen is present in the space. If it is below 19.5%, a person can't breathe in enough oxygen to do physical work. An oxygen level above 23.5% significantly increases the chance for a spark or other ignition source to cause a fire or explosion. The second test deals with gases, vapors, and dusts, which can form flammable or explosive atmospheres. This can occur when the gases or vapors reach concentrations greater than 10% of their lower flammable or explosive limit, also known as LEL. Flammables such as methane, acetylene, carbon disulfide, and gasoline can be found in the air of some confined spaces. If these are allowed to build up beyond their LELs, the situation will become hazardous. Combustible dusts can also be a fire or explosion hazard. If dust obscures your vision at a distance of 5 feet or less, it should be considered above its LEL and therefore dangerous. The third atmospheric test identifies toxic gases or vapors that may be in the air in a confined space. Breathing in these substances can cause illness, even death. Carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide are the two most commonly encountered toxic gases, but there are a number of others as well. It's extremely important to detect leaks or buildups of any gases before they can cause any harm. And remember, even after initial testing has been done in a confined space, periodic testing of the atmosphere must continue to ensure the safety of all entrants.
All right, let's ventilate it, Joe.
If tests reveal that there are atmospheric hazards in a space, the entry supervisor must see to it that continuous forced air ventilation is used to control or eliminate these hazards before anyone may enter the space. However, pure oxygen should never be used in the ventilation process. Adding more oxygen to the atmosphere will dramatically increase the chance of a fire or explosion. Unfortunately, forced air ventilation alone won't always protect entrants from toxic gases and vapors. In these cases, the entry permit may also require the use of a respirator or self-contained breathing apparatus. Because of the many types of hazards that can be present in a confined space, other safe work practices may come into play as well. Hot work permits must be issued for jobs that may produce a spark or flame, such as welding and riveting. This type of activity can also cause caked-on residues to boil off, possibly releasing toxic gases or vapors into the air. Following lockout-tagout procedures is also important. All sources of energy which may affect the work being done or workers' safety must be cut off. For example, heavy moving parts that could trap or crush a worker must be completely shut down. In some instances, it may be impossible to lock out equipment because it is part of a vital service system. If this is the case, other measures must be taken to ensure the safety of those entering the space. When the entry supervisor is certain that all potential dangers have been eliminated from a confined space, they will sign the entry permit and work may begin. During entry operations, the entry supervisor will clear all unauthorized personnel from the permit space area. This keeps untrained workers from interfering or being exposed to situations they are not prepared for. The supervisor will also ensure that entry operations stay within the guidelines set by the permit. If hazards develop at any time, work will be halted and the supervisor will cancel the permit. Now let's look more closely at the role of the entrants, the people who actually enter the confined space. Entrants must know how to use ladders and other gear for safe entry and exit. Set up safety barriers around entry points. And use proper personal protective equipment when working in a confined space. They may also be responsible for monitoring the air inside the space if circumstances require it. Entrants must be able to set up forced air ventilation systems, as well as use explosion-proof lighting equipment in potentially flammable atmospheres. In most cases, entrants wear a chest or full body harness with a retrieval line. This line can be attached at the center of the back near shoulder level or above the head. Wristlets may also be used, but only if it isn't possible to wear a harness. If the space is over 5 feet deep, retrieval lines should be attached to either a fixed point outside the entrance or to a retrieval device, such as a tripod and winch. These non-entry retrieval systems must be used unless they would increase the entrance risk during confined space operations or otherwise fail to facilitate a rescue attempt.
I read you loud and clear.
While inside a confined space, the entrant must stay in constant communication with the attendant in the event of an emergency. In some situations, this may require using two-way communication equipment, such as radios, to do this. If this is the case, the entrant will receive training on how to use this equipment before entering the space. Attendants play a particularly important role in confined space entries. Attendants must undergo the same training as an entrant, but must also be prepared to handle other tasks, such as monitoring the work of all entrants involved in permit work, as well as assisting with their entry and exit. An attendant must also maintain constant communication with those in the space. An attendant may monitor more than one entry space at a time, and may also perform other tasks, such as handing tools down to the entrance. However, these activities must never interfere with their ability to safely monitor all entry personnel and watch out for problems. If you fill the role of an attendant, you must evacuate the entrance from the space if you spot problems, such as the symptoms of oxygen deprivation or exposure to toxic substances. During most entries, an attendant will never enter the confined space, even to perform a rescue. However, an attendant may enter the space if they are specifically authorized by the permit. As an attendant, you must know the space's entry permit inside and out. If a condition arises which is prohibited by the permit, you will need to call for an evacuation. You'll also need to know the exact number of entrants in the space so that everyone can be accounted for if an emergency does occur. In case of an emergency, an attendant may need to contact rescue teams and emergency medical services using information that is written on the permit. So you should also make sure you know where to find material safety data sheets that may be needed by emergency personnel. Many facilities are served by an outside rescue team. In these situations, employers must inform the team about all potential rescue scenarios that could occur. The rescue team must also be given access to the facility's confined spaces for rescue planning and practice sessions. Whenever a permit space is evacuated, an evaluation must be made to find out what went wrong. Only after corrective steps have been taken can the space be re-entered. This means a new permit must be filled out and signed by the entry supervisor.
Okay, looks good. Let me just put my signature on the permit.
Now let's take a closer look at the permit itself. Remember, a permit must be filled out whenever a space is going to be entered. The permit form is set up by your facility using the regulation as a guideline. Information on the permit must include the space to be entered, the purpose of the entry, and the date and authorized duration of entry. The permit must also list the authorized entrants who are involved, as well as the attendant and entry supervisor assigned to the job. All hazards associated with the space must also be identified on the permit, as well as the measures that need to be taken to isolate, control, or eliminate these hazards. Required communication equipment, air monitors, and alarm systems also need to be listed, along with the personal protective equipment that should be worn when working in the space. The permit must also show the conditions that are necessary for safe entry into the space, such as forced air ventilation. The results and times of initial and periodic testing must be recorded, along with the initials of the authorized person doing the testing. The need for any additional work permits for activities such as hot work should also be shown. Lastly, the permit must contain a section on rescue and emergency services. This includes the phone numbers of local rescue squads, police and fire stations, as well as a list of any emergency equipment that must be on hand for the entry. Remember, the entry supervisor must sign the entry permit before work can begin. A permit is valid only until a condition arises which is not allowed by the permit, or until the project is completed. If any problems do occur while entry work is going on, the details should be recorded on the permit for future study. Permits from completed jobs must be kept on file for at least 1 year. This helps to determine if any changes need to be made to your facility's permit plan. As you can see, there can be a number of differences in the way you approach each confined space. The types of hazards you may encounter will determine the procedures to be followed. Some permit spaces may require only a few safety precautions. For instance, in some spaces, the only hazards found are atmospheric. When this is the case, and forced ventilation alone is able to control these hazards, you may not need to take any additional precautions. In fact, an entry permit isn't always required to work in a confined space. If it can be proven without entering a space that it is completely free of hazards, then a space can be designated non-permit. In these cases, work can be done without following the guidelines of a permit-required confined space entry program. For instance, an entrant could work alone without having an attendant on duty. Some permit-required spaces can also be reclassified as non-permit, following the removal of hazards or potential hazards. In these cases, written certification showing that all hazards have been eliminated is required to reclassify the permit space. Sometimes a facility will bring a contractor in to work in confined spaces. When this occurs, the facility must inform the contractor of the existence of permit spaces, as well as the hazards that make them permit required. For their part, the contractor must actively seek out this information before beginning work and inform facility personnel as to what precautions they will be taking. OSHA's permit-required confined space regulation is designed to provide the safest possible conditions for anyone working in or around a confined space. But remember, you have responsibilities as well. Take your training seriously. Use extra precautions when working in or around confined spaces. Wear personal protective equipment. Follow all specified procedures. But most of all, take the time to become familiar with the confined space regulation and your facility's entry permit system. Your life and the lives of your coworkers could depend on it.